Everyone assumes aircraft carriers won the Pacific War because America simply built more of them. More hulls, more planes, more pilots, an industrial avalanche that Japan could never match. That part is true, but it isn't the reason carriers became so lethal that by 1944, a Japanese air raid could be detected, tracked, intercepted, and annihilated before it ever came within visual range of the fleet. That transformation had almost nothing to do with how many planes America built. It had everything to do with an invention most people have never heard of, sitting below decks in a darkened room that changed what a carrier actually was. Standard military thinking in 1942 held that a warship's strength was measured in guns, armor, and aircraft. By that logic, the ship with the most anti-aircraft batteries and the most fighters overhead should win every engagement. Japan believed this completely. Their carriers and escorts carried dense clusters of anti-aircraft guns, and their fighter pilots were, plane for plane, among the best trained in the world. Yet, as the war progressed, Japanese strike formations began dying in numbers that made no tactical sense. Squadrons that had trained for years were being shredded by American fighters that seemed to know exactly where they were coming from before they arrived. Japanese pilots reported with growing alarm that American interceptors appeared to have advanced knowledge of their approach. They were right. They just didn't understand how. The answer was the Combat Information Center, known throughout the fleet simply as the CIC. It did not exist in any recognizable form before the war. It was assembled piece by piece, almost accidentally, out of a problem nobody had solved. A modern warship generated more incoming information than any single officer on the breach could process. Radar returns, sonar contacts, visual sightings, coded radio intercepts, and voice reports from scout aircraft all arrived at once, in different formats, through different stations, often contradicting each other. Before the CIC, this information stayed scattered. A radar operator might spot an inbound contact and report it verbally to whoever happened to be nearby. A lookout on the opposite side of the ship might see something else entirely and never learn the two sightings were connected. The ship's captain, standing on the bridge, was making decisions with a fraction of what his own crew already knew. The CIC solved this by doing something almost embarrassingly simple in retrospect. It put every stream of sensor data into one room, on one plotting table, under one set of eyes. Radar plots were transferred by hand onto a glass-topped chart using grease pencils, continuously updated as new returns came in. IFF equipment, identification friend or foe, distinguished American contacts from Japanese ones on the same screen, a capability that sounds trivial today and was revolutionary in 1943. Fighter direction officers sitting at that table could now see the entire tactical picture, not the fragment visible from their own station. They could watch a Japanese strike group form up 70, 80, 100 miles out, calculate its heading and closing speed, and vector American fighters to intercept it in the open ocean, far from the ships they were protecting, long before Japanese pilots ever saw a wake below them. This is the part that gets lost in most retellings of the Pacific War. The fighter director wasn't a pilot, and often wasn't even senior. Some of the most effective fighter direction officers were junior officers with a talent for spatial reasoning and rapid arithmetic, plucked from ordinary duties and trained for a role that had not existed a year earlier. What mattered wasn't rank. What mattered was that the United States Navy had built an institution that could take raw, chaotic, contradictory sensor data and turn it into a single, coherent picture, fast enough to act on it in real time. Japan never built an equivalent. Japanese ships had radar by 1943. in some cases perfectly capable hardware, but no doctrine, no dedicated personnel, and no centralized process for fusing that information into a single fleet-wide air picture. Their radar operators reported contacts up isolated chains of command, the same fragmented way American ships had operated before the CIC existed. Information without fusion is just noise with better resolution. On June 19, 1944, this difference produced one of the most lopsided air battles in naval history. The Battle of the Philippine Sea began with Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launching 4 massive strike waves from his carrier force, more than 300 aircraft in total, against Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58. American radar picked up the first wave at a range of roughly 150 miles, an interception window that gave Hellcat squadrons enough time to climb to altitude, form up, and position themselves above the incoming Japanese formations before a single bomb was dropped. Fighter direction officers aboard multiple carriers were tracking the same raids simultaneously, cross-referencing plots, correcting for navigational drift, and distributing American fighters across the most probable approach vectors, rather than clustering them defensively over their own decks. The result was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was closer to a turkey shoot, which is exactly what American pilots started calling it before the day was even over. Of the roughly 373 Japanese aircraft committed across all 4 raids, an estimated 240 to 270 were shot down, the overwhelming majority before they got within effective attack range of the American fleet. American losses that day amounted to around 30 aircraft in air combat, a kill ratio that by any conventional metric of naval aviation should not have been mathematically possible against an enemy fielding trained carrier pilots and modern aircraft. Japan lost not just planes, but the last generation of experienced carrier aviators it had left after Midway's earlier losses. The Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered a functional carrier air arm after that afternoon.
Critics at the time, and some historians since, have pointed to Japanese pilot inexperience as the deciding factor, and there is truth in that. By mid-1944, years of attrition had gutted Japan's carrier training pipeline, and many pilots in Ozawa's strike waves had only a fraction of the flight hours their American counterparts had accumulated. But pilot quality alone does not explain interception rates this high, this consistently, across 4 separate raids launched hours apart. Even skilled pilots flying obsolete tactics into a fighter screen that already knows their heading, altitude, and numbers before they arrive will suffer catastrophic losses. The CIC did not make American pilots better shots. It made sure American pilots were already in position, at altitude, facing the right direction before the fight started. In aerial combat, positional advantage before the first shot is fired often matters more than skill after it is.
The CIC was only half of the transformation. The other half was a problem so unglamorous that it rarely appears in dramatic retellings of the war at all: fuel. Japan's carrier doctrine, and indeed its entire naval strategy, assumed that fleets fought within reach of home bases or forward anchorages. Ships that ran low on fuel returned to port, refueled, and returned to sea. This was standard practice for every major navy in the world in 1941, including the American one. It was also, in the vast distances of the Pacific, a severe operational constraint, because it meant no fleet could remain on station, hunting or defending, for more than a few weeks before breaking off to resupply. The American solution was underway replenishment, an idea that existed in primitive form before the war, but was scaled into something entirely new by 1943. A mobile logistics force, nicknamed the Fleet Train, made up of oilers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels that sail with the combat fleet itself, rather than waiting in port. Carriers, cruisers, and destroyers could pull alongside a fleet oiler while still at sea, transfer fuel through hoses strung between the ships, take on ammunition and fresh food, and remain on station indefinitely, without ever returning to a harbor. Task Force 58 during the Marianas Campaign stayed continuously at sea for weeks at a time, striking targets, defending against counterattacks, and repositioning, all while never once returning to a friendly port. Japan's fleet, by contrast, was tethered to its dwindling fuel reserves at Tawi-Tawi and later Brunei, forced into rigid, predictable movements dictated not by tactics, but by how far its tankers could stretch. This mattered enormously at the Philippine Sea because it meant Ozawa's fleet had to launch its strikes from as far away as possible to preserve fuel for the return trip, a decision that lengthened the flight time of his aircraft and gave American radar and fighter direction even more warning before the raids arrived. Mitcher's fleet, unconstrained by the same fuel anxiety, could maneuver freely to keep the sun and wind at its back, launch and recover aircraft on its own schedule, and absorb the cost of extended combat air patrols that would have been fuel prohibitive for a fleet forced to conserve every gallon. Two invisible systems, one processing information and one processing fuel, working together, decided the battle before either fleet's aircraft crossed paths. There is a common thread here with the story of Midway 2 years earlier, and it is worth naming directly because it explains something larger than any single battle. At Midway, the deciding factor was decentralized human judgment. Officers and pilots empowered to make real-time decisions without waiting for orders from above. By 1944, the United States Navy had taken that same philosophy and industrialized it. The CIC was decentralization given a physical room and a repeatable process. Instead of one admiral making every call from a distant flagship, fighter direction officers on multiple carriers were making simultaneous, independent, correct decisions based on a shared, continuously updated picture of reality. The fleet train was the same philosophy applied to logistics. Rather than one central authority dictating when the fleet could fight based on when it could refuel in port, individual task groups could sustain themselves indefinitely and fight on their own timetable. Both systems pushed authority and capability outward, away from a single point of failure, and both systems required an enormous amount of unglamorous institutional investment that produced no headlines and won no medals.
Japan's naval culture, for all its tactical sophistication, never built an equivalent to either system. And this was not an accident of resources. It reflected a deeper assumption about how war should be organized, that superior individual skill, rigorous training, and centralized command would always outperform improvised, distributed systems built by junior officers and enlisted technicians. That assumption had been largely correct for centuries of naval warfare fought at ranges where a captain could see the whole battle with his own eyes. It stopped being correct the moment combat expanded beyond the range of human vision, into radar returns and radio intercepts and fuel curves plotted on a logistics officer's clipboard hundreds of miles from the nearest enemy ship. War had quietly become an information processing problem, and the side that built better institutions for processing information, not necessarily better weapons, started winning battles that should have been close. None of this diminishes the individual courage of the pilots who flew into that fire at Midway, at the Philippine Sea, and everywhere in between. The Hellcat pilots who tore through Ozawa's strike waves on June 19th were skilled and brave, and they earned every kill credited to them that day. But they were also the visible endpoint of an invisible machine. A grease pencil moving across a glass plotting table in a darkened room, a fighter direction officer doing rapid mental arithmetic on closing speeds and intercept vectors, a fuel hose strung between two ships rolling in open ocean swells hundreds of miles from the nearest port. Remove any of those unglamorous pieces, and the same pilots flying the same aircraft arrive too late, too low, or too far from the fight to matter. The trick was never a faster plane or a bigger gun.
It was a room nobody photographed and a fuel line nobody filmed, quietly making sure the pilot in the cockpit already knew where to look before the enemy ever appeared.